Hey, Rick. How are you doing, mate?
Very well, thanks. It's 9:30 here in the UK, so getting to the end of the working day. I know it's like super early for you, and Duane, it's like just the morning, right?
Perfect time for me. Just afternoon. This is great. I love this conference. Thank you.
Brilliant.
Hell yeah.
And of course, we're joined here with Dawn Anderson. How are you doing this morning, Dawn? Oh, sorry, this evening.
It's getting quite late now, as Rick just said. Yeah, no, I'm great, thank you. Yeah, really enjoying the session so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been good. I've watched it all the way through. It's been really good to watch. Yeah, good quality.
Yeah. 100%. We've only got half an hour for this, and I really want to get stuck into the questions. So, Rick, do you want to take away with how knowledge will define the future of search and what to do about it now?
Yeah, for sure. So let's get a screen share going on.
Beautiful.
So the topic is how knowledge is going to change the future of search and what to do about it. And like, honestly, I'm honored to be joined by such amazing people on the panel because there are some of the experts in this field. So I really want to spend as much time as we can getting into questions. So like you, so I thought we'd just start with a level set of what do we mean by knowledge? Why is it important? Why does it matter? And that will lead on to a great conversation, I'm sure. So I think the first point is we're living in an age where we as people are constantly being pushed to ask for more. There's the whole idea that attention spans are dropping, but actually it's more that engagement rates are dropping and people's propensity to engage is decreasing. But ultimately, we are hungry for more information as we get more and more intelligent services. I think we've all seen a graph that looks like this in terms of in the context of search. It's the classic keyword graph, right? It's the idea of head terms being the high volume, high competition stuff, the mid tail being the kind of middle competition, middle volume stuff, and the long tail being the low competition, but also super low volume stuff. And I think we're all really used to this. The problem is, or the challenge with this is a great way of thinking up until the point where we started asking more complicated and complex questions. 15% of searches are totally brand new every day. There's 800 million searches a day, if you believe the numbers. 70% of searches are considered long tail, 3 keywords or more. And actually now you can go through the mid tail, as we call it, without actually having to search for anything else because you get answers directly in the search results. So this whole idea that we've got this traditional graph where you've got very nice even proportions, a very simple curve is great, except actually it's more like the Nike swoosh these days, where you've got a load of terms that are not that high number of volume in terms of how many they are, but high volume in terms of people that search them. They're still high competition. You've got this kind of mid-tail that sort of does and doesn't exist, or at least it's something where people can interact and use the SERP features to find out more and engage with. And then you've got this whole opportunity out there, which we consider as the long tail, which is where the majority of search is happening these days. And that's awesome, right? That's a really cool place to be. But that and ultimately what that means is we're getting searches that look like this, right? This is a search that we might 10 years ago have typed into the search engines and realized, we got terrible results back. And I think a key takeaway is that Google, and I'm sure everyone on this webinar knows that Google isn't looking at this anymore and going, well, let's match words to words and let's find a website that has this exact phrase on it. It's saying, well, actually, this phrase can be broken down into lots of component parts. Best equals 4-star, tonight being, actually, it's not Friday, it's another day, but you get where I'm going with this. What we might not realize, so this is great. This is a long tail query. This is something that might only get searched once a year, but there might be, so many different variants of this that makes up that 15% of that long tail. Actually, what we are getting to the point of now is someone can search something like pizza near me. And because the user, and I'm going to reference a point that Dawn made in one of her presentations I saw, which I thought was awesome. Like the user is the query. Like people have contextual information around them. They have history. They have demographic data, inferred intent. The phone or the device they're using has location data. And as a result, search engines, you can type in a very short query like this, which can, we'd expect to have certain results, and there'd be a very different result based on the user. So this whole idea of knowledge, this whole idea that there isn't just a set of results being matched to a set of words is really important. And for answer engines, and I'm going to use the word answer engines intentionally here, like they're just not ready. And this ultimately is an opportunity for us, but it's a challenge for these machines as well. If we think of this idea of result approximation, so this is a piece of research I did using Semrush data. Like as the query gets more kind of specific, what we typically expect is that the number of search results, and let's say that in this case we're going to have queries that get longer by the number of words that are in them, we'd expect that the number of results would decline. It would be a smaller number of results as the query gets more and more specific. Actually, what I've seen from data that collected from Semrush, and this is across an amalgamation across lots of different markets and lots of different verticals, is that the results length, the number of results as the longer the query gets actually increases up to a certain point. This is really interesting. It suggests that either Google is just bringing together, like there's a bit of a knowledge gap that Google has, a search engine have, and intelligence services have, where they're bringing together shorter queries together to figure out like a group of results that at least makes sense for someone that does want to search more deeply in that instance. Or there's this whole idea of result diversity, which I'm really keen that we pick up as part of the questions, where Google is trying on different result sets to see what fits, to see what's right for the user. And that's where this idea of kind of different results and more results comes from. But ultimately, to get to this level of information, there needs to be some knowledge there. So I want to consider the idea of what a knowledge graph is. I think this is really important before we get into the sort of the question side. So the systems have evolved to understand us, not our inputs. So a lot of people, when we talk about knowledge graphs, wonder what we're talking about. Well, we're not talking about one of these, although the concept isn't actually unrelated. We're really talking about one of these, which is also known as a network, or it could be a spider diagram. But the point is, this is as much a graph as the thing on the left-hand side. It's made up of vertices, nodes, points of data, and edges, or the connections between them. And so you can have a topic like Italian cuisine that is very easy to relate to other components within the graph. Why this is really cool is because you can start to link data to get together that is non-uniform in a way that's really meaningful, way more meaningful than any other data structure. So in this case, we've got a simple data structure. We've got mozzarella cheese relates to margherita pizza, it relates to Italian cuisine. In this case, we've got a relationship, which is what we call a semantic triple. It's a subject-object relationship, a thing that relates to another thing with what we call the predicate, the information, the relationship that can be described in a certain way. And that's awesome. That's something that already gives you that extra level of detail than what a sort of normal, typical database might provide. And this is an example of how we can add this data together. So mozzarella cheese is used in margherita pizza, which is part of Italian cuisine. Actually, we can go one level deeper because each of our nodes can have descriptive attributes, can have these value pairs, these structured data in the sense of SEO that describe even more information about it. These don't need to be uniform between objects, and that means we can do really cool things with this. But to give you guys an example, this is what we're talking about in the context of the examples I gave before. So why is this really helpful? Well, traditionally, when it comes to relational databases, how many students are in a school might be a really quite easy question to answer, because if you've only got 4 students and you've only got one place you need to go for that, you can see there's 4, and the answer is very clearly 4. A knowledge graph, a graph database, can do exactly the same thing. You can see it probably hard to see with the purple, but we can still identify that there are 4 students in this example. This is a really simple question. When we ask a more challenging question, like how many GCSE students are female and take maths within a certain database, a relational database might need to go to several different groupings of tables to figure out this answer. That's a slow process. That's something that requires a lot of processing power. And if you imagine how responsive we expect search engines to be and intelligence services to be, like, this would be a really difficult way to do this. Perhaps it's one. Who knows at this point? Using a graph database, using a knowledge graph, this is a much easier query to answer, because you can very clearly trace back different attributes within different data structures, and you can get to the answer in this case that there is one. This is why we use knowledge graphs, or why we use graph databases specifically for these kind of more complicated data tasks where we're using tons of non-uniform data sets. So that's broadly speaking what we mean by a graph database, and clearly a knowledge graph is a type of graph database. And actually, let's talk about this in the context of what we mean in the web and what a knowledge graph in and of itself really is. So firstly, the web is a really broad and deep view into what it means to be human, right? It's not just a reflection of documents, it's all of the meaning of how documents relate to each other, interlinked and put together in a meaningful way. We can have these things called entities, these subject objects in the triple, the nodes in the network that tell us about things. And we can describe those things in terms of the things that make them up, the value pairs, which may also be entities in their own right. So in this case, West Ham United, a football team, might play in the division, the Premier League, and the Premier League might be a thing that has its own depth of data. And the reason why this is great is because you can ask a question like, who did West Ham play on Boxing Day last year? So if you guys don't know, Boxing Day is the day after Christmas in the UK. And the answer is very clearly Crystal Palace, and there's a very clear route to information. What's awesome about this data structure is that you can ask a question that's a little bit more complex. What type of aircraft fly out of London? Now, Airbus 321 probably doesn't have a very clear link to London as a concept, but you can get there by knowing that London has airports and the airports have operating airlines, and the operating airlines fly certain aircraft. So the links, the relationships between data, and then the depth of the data within those specific nodes is really important. And then you ask Google a query. Yes, it's going and fetching documents to bring it back to you, but what it's also doing is understanding what you're looking for in real world context, and that's really important. But to bring it back to this idea of a graph, like a more traditional graph, really what we're saying is that London and Airbus exist on two axes of this graph. And we're just trying to figure out, like, on a scale of London to Airbus 321, where do different things sit? That's one way of considering or thinking about how we're navigating a graph. Now, London connects to tons and tons of different things. And you can see very quickly how this gets to this kind of network structure, which is what ultimately we're talking about when we talk about a knowledge graph, right? It's lots of things that can be described in terms of the things that make them up that relate to other things in a meaningful way. And it's really important that we as search marketers, and particularly as technical SEOs, start to understand this, because when we talk about things like structured data, this is where that can be really important to helping search engines both understand what you're about, but placing what you do in the context of all the things it already knows. Why do we care? Well, because people trust search engines, even if these systems aren't trustworthy in themselves, right? We know that search engines use subjective truth, data signals to figure out what is right and wrong. But recent study from Yext looked at the sort of trust in demographic data, and it showed that generally speaking, people felt like they didn't understand, they didn't trust the data, or kind of didn't have a strong opinion about whether they trusted the data in Google or not. Actually, Path Interactive went one step further and looked at this on a different age group level. And what their data shows is that the oldest age group in their sample were 29% less trusting of the younger demographic, the 18 to 25. And of course, you can remember that the 14 to 18s, the younger kids, the people that are just starting to use search engines, are going to be even more trusting than that. So why am I going on about demographics and trust? Well, because ultimately, we're about to see the largest transfer of wealth that has ever happened in the kind of the history of man. Over the next 25 years, $68 trillion is going to move from the older generation, the generation that don't trust these search engines, don't entrust the information, don't trust the answers, to the generation that do. And if your brand, your business as a technical SEO, you're not structuring your data in a way that's meaningful, you are missing out on revenue as this generation comes to become your customers over the next few years. I said I have an opportunity, and I'll sort of finish on this as a point so we can get into some questions. But the reason why this is an opportunity is because right now there's massive voids in the data, right? There's holes, and solving them as search marketers must be our priority. One, because it's really good for the kind of future of the web to have that information provided and to provide this great resource for kind of generations to come, but also because from a revenue perspective, this is where search can be won. This is where if your brand isn't answering questions, and as a technical SEO, you're not structuring your data to make that an easy process, this is where you can make the biggest gains. This is data from InLinks that looks at the recognition of how well documents or how well certain the knowledge graph API from Google can recognize certain concepts within documents. And what you see is that in law, about 40% of the time it's successful, and all the way down to like marketing content. Of course, that marketing content is the one that has the lowest level of understanding, typical, right? You're down to less than 10%. There's a 23% average recognition rate here. So that means that on average, the sort of amount of information that's recognized in documents within each of these topics is about 23%. But we've got to remember that's 23% out of a potential 100%, which means there's a whole world of information out there. Remember, that's probably represents 20% of, like, that 20% of knowledge might represent 80% of the total searches that happen. But actually, if you're starting to claw back value in those 20%, as that 15% total of new searches starts to grow and grow and grow, that's where you start to win. And this is already a challenge today. I'll finish it on this point. a lot of people think about knowledge graphs and entities and the idea of things and data and structuring their information as a future-facing concept, as something that's to future-proof you. This information, this challenge, it's already here today. People are already going to search engines, finding information, trying to work out what to do and make decisions based on it, and they're not always getting it right. So there's two sides to this. There's a revenue opportunity for you and your business to get this right. But actually, this is where we as search marketers have a higher calling. This is where the future and integrity of the web really depends on what we do as search marketers now. So with that in mind, thank you for listening. I hope you guys found that interesting. That's the presentation element.
Thank you so much for that, Rick. That's awesome. Really, really awesome. I kind of want to just take it straight to you, Don and Duane. Just let's get some thoughts from that presentation. What's your main takeaways from that? We'll go Dawn first.
Well, there's still a huge opportunity out there, lots of gaps. I think we often think that search engines are further on than they actually are. As marketers, as users of a search engine, and they're nowhere near where they need to be to have full understanding. Obviously, we have things like BERT and we have machine learning coming through, but when it comes to actual precision and intent understanding, they're still a country mile away. And that's where, for instance, the likes of passage indexing and the search result diversification are really needed, because even if they fully understood everything about a query, they still don't understand. There's so many ways in which people can mean the same thing, but say it in a different way. And that goes right the way back to the age-old vocabulary problem. And that's just human nature. So we phrase the same thing in different ways. So those are really big challenges, and there's still a long, long way to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm gonna say, I think everything that Don is saying is true. Obviously, Rick and we have conversations on this stuff all the time, so we're very tightly aligned on this. But if you look at the state of where we are with search today, right, and to Don's point, it's really easy to think, oh, everything is super advanced, it's very leading edge, that kind of scenario. And in some ways it is. For a machine to be able to pull a passage, a segment of a conversation off a page and know that that is the right answer for your question, that's pretty advanced level stuff. And yet, almost every query that you run, even branded queries where you've expressly stated what you want, have a level of ambiguity built into them that requires Google to then populate, people also asked, for things that are not related to the brand or are showing a competitor's brand. Because did you actually mean the brand, or were you using the brand to mean a product type? And Google doesn't know that on top. So it needs to ask the question to learn, to figure that out. And along the way, it's also using you and your input to train its machine learning systems to hopefully get smarter over time. So there's a massive amount to this, the core concept of a knowledge graph. I sincerely hope people adopt this and they understand it. SEOs, you absolutely have to understand what a knowledge graph is, how to build it, how to utilize it, and how the engines are using these things in the future, because this is going to define search over our next decade. No doubt in my mind.
Yeah. And typically, with I think brands becoming such an important player in this space, and it's really coming out into more with like their knowledge graphs. When you're seeing like your brands not show up and be well understood, of course it's a long game, but what are the kinds of things that you start to look at to start thinking about tackling that? I will put it just to the panel.
Ambiguous. Well, basically for me, if I'm working on a website and I see, for instance, that I have what I call forks, categorical forks, where one marketing team is dealing with a product range and they kind of have products that really should be in a different category in their section, you end up with dilution, and that can end up with ambiguity. I think the key is to constantly check for possible mixed signals, semantic mixed signals around what something could possibly mean. Like, is a plumber a heating engineer? What if the plumber also deals with boilers? Is he then a gas fitter? Is he a wet bathroom fitter? And so forth. And I know that space really well. So, and that's a problem we often see, where you end up with a heating engineer jumping above a gas fitter, jumping above a plumber, because a lot of especially in natural language, if you have people that want a quote for something, it'll tend to have a lot of crossover terminology that is confusing. So I think you have to step back, actually just put your very, very logical human head on and say, is it possible that these words could be connected and mixed up? And then try to do more division, try to reinforce with more semantic signals. And things like internal linking as well. Anchors are really powerful, just to send those extra reinforcements. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
Awesome.
for me, this is really straightforward, guys. If you want to start in on building a knowledge graph, like start a spreadsheet, start putting products, services, SKUs, the founders of your business, the history, the list of URLs, any attribute or entity from your business, put it in there. Start building that resource out. Because as Dawn is saying, like, this stuff gets confusing. Like, if we use the word engineer, what exactly do we mean by engineer? It means different things to different people. And to a local plumber who's being guided by a local SEO who doesn't really know what they're doing, the word engineer is just something I should rank for, and maybe not applicable to the work they're doing. I just need the caulking replaced in my tub, in my shower. I don't need an engineer for that. I need a handy person for that. And yet you're optimizing for this, thinking somehow that's going to drive me to call you. And ultimately the search engine is looking at that going, but you're not an engineer, are you? So be clear, be very straightforward.
I know I'm jumping in. I'm jumping in, and Rick should probably speak here now. But
good.
But engineer is such an ambiguous term anyway. One of my clients is in the IT recruitment space, and the whole IT recruitment space generally has changed a lot over the past few years. And really, developer now has the same name as an engineer. Everybody suddenly seems to call themselves an architect. You end up with architect's jobs coming through, but really it's an IT architect, then you've got a data architect. And somebody actually put a blog post out or a big massive tweet that said, hey, if you're confused and you're looking for a job in the IT space, this is what all the terminology means. They all mean the same. So if it's confusing for people looking for a job, how much more confusing is it for a search engine trying to understand these entities that they're trying to tear apart, if you like?
Well, and Dawn, this goes right back to your earlier point, right? Human nature, human language, and then let's just pick the English language, one of the most complex and hard to understand, because
but most widely used one.
Yeah. I mean, there's people need to remember, as advanced as these systems are, they are still linear in their processing. As fast as they are, and as impressive as that speed is, it's not actually magic. What happens in our brains is magic. And there's still a gap there, right? So you doing this work helps fill that gap in.
For sure. And I think the thing we need to remember is that the web is just a reflection of the information that we put onto it. And ultimately, that's the data set that Google is using to, or search engine intelligence systems are using to learn about concepts that it thinks are the case or not. So if we put a lot of information out there that's super optimized because we think that, let's say in the context of engineer, that's the high value keyword that we just got to keep smashing in the page until we get to the point where, we can only, like, we're using it in every other word. Like, if every business is doing that, one, there's no competitive advantage to that, period. Two, we're telling Google that the thing that we are describing is this thing called an engineer, when we as humans call it a totally different thing. So then when the person searches the totally different thing, Google doesn't associate it to the thing that you've been like stuffing the hell out of, because it makes no sense. Like, that's not what people use. So it's a case of we're at the point where there are knowledge gaps, but like, if we fill it by training it with what we think people will search for, what we're missing was what people actually are looking for, and that's creating like this kind of knowledge gap squared type effect.
Well, it always comes back to you shall know a word by the company it keeps.
Yeah.
And you know, well, we discussed this last week. That is a reflection of real life, because we talked about K-BERT, very briefly touched on that, which is knowledge BERT, because what they've discovered as well in quite a lot of articles and literature out there is that, unsurprisingly, these vectors actually translate into the real world, and that's really not a surprise. You know, that the word gas tends to go with plumber and boiler and fitter and, you know, in just general conversation, and things. So the web and search volume and keywords, etc., are really just a reflection of life. So
exactly.
Yeah.
We've got 4 minutes, and I'm really kind of wondering what kind of question to ask in this kind of time. But I think maybe just like one little snippet takeaway for the future. And you know, Bill Slasky's written a lot on this topic, but maybe like a little bit of a takeaway on personalized knowledge graphs. You know, from just the panel.
Well, my takeaway would be, when it comes to SEO, build strong structures. Even if you don't go out and build a knowledge graph, make sure you always watch some videos on category theory for a start, and then you'll stand yourself in very good stead.
That's awesome.
I'll say this, guys. If you guys are still practicing SEO from 5 years ago, you need to update. You need to get up on these concepts, and you need to understand how the search engines are moving in a different direction, to answering questions using intent modeling to understand where consumers will be on their journey. Google released about 3 months ago a white paper called The Messy Middle. Go read it. It will open your eyes as to exactly what the customer journey looks like today. Forget your models. You think your models are still good because you did them 18 months ago. Let me tell you, that's eons ago. You need to stay current, and current is complex. It is not straightforward.
Yeah, and I'm going to echo that point and say, ultimately, when we think about the world, we as marketers, and I do this, I've just started taking on paid as a remit. So we often think about things in terms of linear journeys, like starts here, ends here. It absolutely doesn't. All right. The way that you're going to keep connected to have that continuous conversation with your consumers that you're trying to attract to your website, or people you're trying to engage, is through making sure that your information is as readily accessible and clear as you possibly can. That is better than SEO, any kind of hack or tactic out there. Like, that's the way that you need to, like, remember, it's an information retrieval system. Hence the information retrieval component is important.
Task-driven search. That's it. People have tasks to do. So you have to keep helping them. Micro tasks, major tasks, etc. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
That is a fantastic place to bookend it. We are woefully I would love to keep going with this, but of course, like, that is our time for this session.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your time, Ric Rodriguez, Duane Forrester, and Don Anderson. How can people find you can you keep the conversation going after this?
Twitter, Donnie Ando, mostly.
Twitter at Duane Forrester, or, you know, put me into a search engine. Give that a try. I'm easy to find.
Yeah. I'll also say Twitter at Ric Rodriguez _UK.
Yeah, phenomenal. Thank you so much, guys. That's awesome.